Good morning again. Thank you for joining us here at Christ Community Church today. And at this time, our kids K through 5 are dismissed for Children's Church. If they have not left already, they're planning to go. So again, thank you for joining us this morning. It's good to see you guys here with us today as we continue this series, Conversations with Jesus. Now, a quick tidbit about me. When I was a kid, I was in Boy Scouts for a very brief window. Any scouts in the room, like Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts? Just the one? Not too many. It wasn't super popular with me either. I did not stick with it. It wasn't my cup of tea. But one of the only quintessential Boy Scout things I remember doing as a kid was going on a big hike. There was a Boy Scout camp kind of near where we lived, and there was a big nature preserve that was right next to it that had 25 miles of trails, or has, I should say. And so we went on a hike on one Saturday morning on these trails. And it was supposed to be like a 1 or 2 mile, just a real quick little hike. We were third graders or something at the time, so not prepared to go super far. But along the way, there's lots of forks in the road, and we took some wrong turns. And before we knew it, by the time we got back to the campsite, we had hiked probably 10 miles. We just kept hiking and all day long. We just couldn't find our way back. My scout leaders, I don't know if they forgot the map or if they just were reading it wrong, but just evidently every fork we came to, they chose the wrong one. And before long, my dad, who was in the military and goes on hikes and stuff all the time, he's finally all right, I'm taking over, where I'm going to get us home. And we ended up finding our way back. But I remember my dad was actually carrying one of my friends on his back by the time we were back because just of how far we had hiked before we finally made it back. Now, if you've ever been in the woods, maybe not quite that bad of a situation before, but you've ever been out hiking and you come to one of these forks in the road, have you ever been in that situation where you didn't know which way to go? Where you're out there, you're hiking, you come to that spot, and you're just not sure. Maybe you didn't take the map with you, or you forgot, or for whatever reason, especially in those pre-GPS days, you come to that fork and you don't know which way to choose. And maybe one of those roads is going to take you back to the car, maybe it's a half mile or a mile, and you're going to be back at the car, it's over. But that other path, is going to be 10 miles of rough terrain, and you're not going to be having lunch for a while if you choose the wrong path. So what do you do in that situation? Well, I suppose you have a few different options, right? You could look at both of the paths and try to figure out, well, which one has been taken more, which one looks more beaten in, figure maybe that's the shorter one, and I'll go that way, or you could wait for a while, and you could see if somebody else comes along that knows the road, or which road to take. You could hike a ways down one of them and see if maybe something jogs your memory, or if you get further than a mile, you could turn back and figure that's the wrong way, or you could just sit there and just try to remember the map and try to figure it out. Or you could just, I suppose, take a blind guess at it. But whichever route you ultimately end up taking, there's going to be that moment of hesitation. A moment where you stand there at that fork, and whatever your system is for figuring out which way to go, you've got to pause there for a little bit and try to figure it out. And I feel like this is a really good picture of what doubt can be. I think a lot of times when we think of doubt, we assume it's this kind of cynical, skeptical position, somebody that's just trying to prove somebody wrong. They're doubting because they're looking for the answer to be no. But that's not always the case. That can be the case. But that's not always, and in fact, I would dare say that's not even most often the case. I think doubt can also be just an honest attempt at figuring out what's true. Just like standing there at that fork in the road and just trying to figure out which path is the path that's going to take me home. Which road should I take? That can also be a picture of doubt, just trying honestly to figure out what's true. Well, the thing is that standing there in that spot between not knowing and yet needing to know to be able to make a choice, that can be a tough place to be. We're in the series again called Conversations with Jesus. And we're looking at stories in the Gospels where Jesus had conversations with either a person or a group of people, primarily about this idea of doubt or faith or struggles for these people to believe. And what we're seeing through the series is that if Jesus was comfortable with people coming to him with their doubts and their questions, then the church also ought to be a place where people are comfortable asking their questions or expressing those doubts. Again, people are going to ask those questions somewhere, and so shouldn't the church of all places be a safe place for people to do that? Unfortunately, it's often not. And so that's what we want to make sure through this series is that Christ Community Church can be a safe place to express our questions or be open about our doubts. And last week, as we're exploring this, we talked about the story of Nicodemus, and we learned how we move from doubt to belief. Not necessarily when we have all of the answers. We move when we decide to trust God, even when we don't have all the answers. We talked about how the opposite of doubt is not having all the information. The opposite of doubt is belief. And it's coming to that point where we can say, okay, God, even though I don't know everything, I do know enough that I can just trust you. But here's the thing is that for many of us, we still are going to come to that fork in the road situation, where even though we're saying, to some extent, I believe, we're also saying to move forward, to take the next step, we need some more information. We need some answers to some of those questions. And so what do we do when we don't have those answers? What we find is that there is that space between needing to know so we can move forward and not knowing, and that can be a major struggle. And that's what the story we're going to look at today, I think, depicts for us. It's found in the book of Mark, chapter 9, starting in verse 14. It's called, it says, in my Bible, the title is Jesus Heals a Boy Possessed by an Impure Spirit. So let's take a look at the story. First of all, it begins by saying, when they came to the other disciples, they saw a large crowd around them. Well, hold on a second. It says, when they came to the disciples. Well, when who came to what other disciples? We need to backtrack a little bit in the story to see what's going on here. So the beginning of chapter 9 is a story that's often called the transfiguration of Jesus. And what happened here in the story is that Jesus took 3 of his disciples, Peter, James, and John, on top of this mountain. Now, we all know probably there are 12 disciples. You've probably heard that number thrown out before, 12 disciples. But oftentimes, Jesus didn't just do stuff with the 12 disciples. I mean, he had a relationship with them. They followed him. They were very close, all 12 of them. But of those 12, there were 3 that were considered like the inner circle, that Jesus had an even closer relationship with. Those 3 were Peter, James, and John. And there's several stories throughout the New Testament or throughout the Gospels where Jesus takes just those 3 aside. And this is one of those stories. He takes them up on this mountain. And while they're up there, this incredible event happens where God shows up in this very real, visible way and declares that Jesus is his son. And Moses and Elijah appear, and Jesus is talking with them. And Peter and James and John are kind of confused by everything that's happening. They're not really sure what to do. But the one thing they recognize in this moment is that Jesus really is who he says he is. He is the Son of God in the flesh. And so they come down from this mountain, and that's where this next story begins. So that's the they we're talking about, Peter, James, John, and Jesus. And they come to the other disciples, the other 9 who didn't go onto the top of the mountain. And says they saw a large crowd around them and the teachers of the law arguing with them. As soon as the people saw Jesus, they were overwhelmed with wonder and ran to greet him. So they come down and find the other 9 disciples, and there's sort of some chaos happening. There's an argument between the disciples and between the teachers of the law, and there's a crowd around just kind of watching and probably egging them all on. And then Jesus shows up, and they realize this is the guy we need to turn to get the answers. So Jesus says in verse 16, "What are you arguing with them about?" he asked. A man in the crowd answered, "Teacher, I brought you my son who is possessed by a spirit that has robbed him of his speech. Whenever it seizes him, it throws him to the ground. He foams at the mouth, gnashing his teeth, and becomes rigid. I asked your disciples to drive out the spirit, but they could not." So what we see in the story, first of all, is that there's a father who has a son who is being tormented by the spirit. That there's something going on here, and it's causing like some physical problems, it's causing some mental issues, and the son is just not where he needs to be. It's throwing the son to the ground. It's causing all sorts of issues. It's attacking this boy. And so the father is desperate, and he brings his son to the disciples. But these other 9 disciples, again, with Jesus not there, with the other 3 up on the mountain, the other disciples are not able to drive out this demon. And I think that this is where the argument is coming from. Because what I think is going on is that the teachers of the law, the Pharisees, they see that the disciples are not able to perform this miracle, and now they jump on this opportunity to try to expose that Jesus and his disciples, they're not for real. Because if they were really from God, then they should be able to do miracles. And the fact that they're unable to perform this miracle, they're just saying that is all the proof that they need that they're not from God. And so obviously the disciples are arguing back with them, the crowd is around them, and now Jesus shows up. And notice, though, that Jesus' attention is not on the debate. He's not interested in getting into a debate. He's not interested in arguing with the Pharisees. He turns his attention to this father and the son, the ones who are actually in trouble here. You unbelieving generation, it goes on to say in verse 19, Jesus replied, how long shall I stay with you? How long shall I put up with you? Bring the boy to me. Now, Jesus appears really frustrated in this verse. And if we read it maybe in a certain way, it kind of looks like Jesus is being a little harsh, judgmental, maybe cold and callous in the situation. Because he's looking at this argument, he's looking at the situation with this boy, and he's not being healed. And we could read this as Jesus saying, you unbelieving, you faithless generation. What's wrong with you? But I don't think that's really what's going on here, because if we look at the character of Jesus and the other statements that Jesus makes throughout the Gospels, that's not who he was. He wasn't harsh and judgmental. So I think what's really going on here is that he is frustrated, but I think it's coming from a place of compassion and care. Because what's happening is that he is looking at the situation, and he knows that if people would just have faith, that it would be so much better. That we wouldn't suffer if we just had faith in him, and that we wouldn't struggle as much as we do if we would just follow him. And yet he's watching as that's not the case, right? People are unfaithful. We still sin. We still struggle. We don't choose to follow him. And I think that's heartbreaking for Jesus to watch. It's kind of like this. Imagine you're out in the ocean on a boat, and your boat sinks, and you are stranded out in the ocean. You're just floating, right? You're a goner. You're in trouble. But miraculously, out of nowhere, along comes a boat. And they throw you a life preserver. And they say, come on, we'll save you out of the water. This is kind of like what Jesus is doing. He's watching all of us kind of out to sea. He's watching all of us struggling. And he's coming out there, throwing us the life preserver. But instead of taking it, it's like the person in the water saying, you know what? I'm good. I don't need the life preserver. I see you guys are going west. I was actually planning on going east, so I think I'm just going to wait here for a while. Or instead of taking the life preserver, they say, well, wait a second. Who are you guys? I mean, why should I get in a boat with you? Are you good people? Or do you have a bed for me to sleep in? Do you have good snacks for me to eat? Who would do that, right? Nobody. You would take the life preserver and you would get on the boat and you would figure out all the rest later. But it's like Jesus is watching us refusing the life preserver for all sorts of ridiculous reasons. He's watching us choosing to not believe in him, knowing that if we would just believe in him, everything would be better, right? We would have so much better of a life. We could be forgiven of our sins. We could start to overcome our struggles. We would be making better choices, and yet we reject him anyway, and he watches us making those choices. He watches, because of our lack of faith, our lives are spiraling out of control, and I think that brings pain to Jesus to have to watch us do that. And he watches us do that over and over again. And so I feel like the statement that he makes is coming from a place of compassion. He wants us to believe because he knows our lives would be so much better if we did. But again, he ends by saying, bring me the boy. He's not interested in the debate. He wants to intervene in this boy's life. And so go to verse 20. So they brought him. When the spirit saw Jesus, it immediately threw the boy into a convulsion. He fell to the ground and rolled around, foaming at the mouth. Jesus asked the boy's father, how long has he been like this? From childhood, he answered. Now, I think that this verse highlights something that Jesus says in the book of John, chapter 10, verse 10, where Jesus says, the thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. I have come that they may have life and have it to the full. Jesus wants life for us. Again, I think that's why he was frustrated in the previous verse. He wants us to be living our life to the full, to be living the way that God designed us to live, to be living in belief of God and in close relationship with God. But there's another power at work. The power of Satan is at work. The power of the enemy of God is at work. And that power wants to steal and kill and destroy. And we see this very vividly in the story with this boy, because when this boy, with this evil spirit, comes face to face with Jesus, the spirit throws this boy into a convulsion. It's basically throwing a temper tantrum. It's saying it does not want this boy to experience the life that Jesus has to offer. And so it's trying to kill him and destroy him. And Jesus, again, he asks out of compassion, how long has this been happening? And the father says, from childhood. So this has been going on for a long time. Continue in verse 22. It has often thrown him into fire or water to kill him. But if you can do anything, take pity on us and help us. I'm going to pause there a second. I love that the father says, take pity on us and help us. Not take pity on my son and help my son, but I mean, parents can relate in this room. When your child is suffering, you're suffering, right? It's not just the son's suffering here. It's the father and son together. It's the family is suffering because of what's happening. And so he says, take pity on us and help us. But he also says, if, right? If you can help us. And Jesus goes on in verse 23 and says, if you can, said Jesus, everything is possible for the one who believes. Immediately the boy's father exclaimed, I do believe. Help me overcome my unbelief. The story is highlighting the need for belief. And I think that the place where we see this father here in the story, I think it's a place that most all of us at some point in our lives, maybe even right now in your life, can relate to. This place caught between belief and unbelief. You know, he's saying, Jesus, I believe, but I also don't believe. You know, I believe enough that I brought my son here. I am taking this chance that maybe you can heal him. But at the same time, I'm not really sure. I mean, your disciples already failed. He's been like this since childhood. I don't know. Maybe I would have been better off staying at home and not getting my hopes up. And I think a lot of us can probably relate to being caught in that position before. I mean, here you are. You know, you're in church, right? You're among other believers. You're at a worship service. So on one hand, maybe you're saying, okay, I believe somewhat. I'm curious. I want to know, like, or there's a part of me that thinks this is true, that there's this God that he can help my situation, that he's good, that he wants what's best for me, that it would be good for me to follow him. But at the same time, I think we struggle with unbelief. You know, is that God really good? Is he going to help me in my situation? Is the step that he's asking me to take actually going to work out well for me, or is it going to be harmful to me? You know, or I have all of these questions, and I'm not sure what the answers are to them. And so, yeah, I believe, but there's also a lot of things that I struggle to believe in. I might believe in a God, but, you know, some of the stories in the Bible, I don't know. They're kind of wild. I don't know if I can believe all of that stuff. And so we find ourselves caught in this place between belief and unbelief. And I want to go back to that picture, you know, of being at the fork in the road. The place between those two paths. Sometimes we find ourselves trapped in that spot. There's a couple of words in the New Testament for doubt. One of them means to be between two minds or to have two minds. The other word that's often used for doubt means to hesitate between two paths. And the picture that those two words generate, I think we can really relate to that. Again, doubt isn't always just this skepticism and cynicism, but it's this place where we're caught between do I believe or not. Yesterday, my family went and got some ice cream. And it was one of the rare times where I walked in and I read the description of one of the flavors. It was over here at the Icebox in town. There was one called Puppy Chow, and it was peanut butter ice cream with chocolate ribbon and Puppy Chow treats. And I didn't know what the Puppy Chow treats were, but I knew that sounded really good, and I got a sample of it, and I'm like, that's the one I'm getting. I don't even want to try anything else. But that is rare for me, because usually I sample like 10 different things before I pick something. And I find myself, you know, that idea of being between two minds. Like there's a part of me that wants chocolate. There is also a part of me that wants vanilla, and I am torn between the two, right? Now, it's one thing when you're choosing between two different types of food, and you are between two minds, but what about if you're in a situation where the stakes are a little higher? Like, I don't know what career path to choose. Right? Should I be an engineer or should I be an artist? You know, like I don't know which one to choose. And then it gets even trickier what about relationships? You know, somebody who's dating. Should I date this person or that person? Should we have kids? Should we not have kids? You know, and the stakes keep getting higher. And then especially when it comes between choosing right or wrong or choosing belief or unbelief. Am I going to follow God or not? Do I believe that the Bible is true or don't I? And we can find ourselves on one hand saying, I believe it's true. I'm of one mind, I say, yes, it's true. But the other part of me says, no, I don't. I'm between belief and unbelief. And it's like we're standing again at that fork in the road. And we're looking ahead and we're saying, I don't know if I should go down this path of I believe it, I'm all in, or this other path of none of it's true, it's all a joke, you know? And asking those tough questions about our faith, it feels like that. We don't know which one of those paths to choose. And we have those questions and we're wrestling with them and we don't know what answer is right. And it can feel like that, right? But I think that what the story here is highlighting for us is that our faith can only grow when we're honest about those questions or we're honest about those doubts. You know, it's one thing to stand there at the fork in the road and say, I don't know if I should go this way or that way, and I need some more information so I can figure it out. It's another thing to deny that the fork is even there. Then we're really stuck, right? We're just stopped there, and we're not even looking down either path. Here's how this has kind of worked out in my life. When I was like 24 years old, I think it was back in like 2004, and I had made this decision that I had basically agreed with God, okay, I'll go into ministry, I'll be a pastor, and I was going to go to seminary or like pastor training school. And so I had left my hometown where I'd grown up, and I moved to another city where the school was, and I was ready to start this training to go into ministry, to become a pastor. And you might think that this is a point in somebody's life, if you've committed, you're going to be a pastor, you're going to go into ministry, like, you've got to be pretty solid in your faith, you've got to have some answers, like, you are ready to commit, to go all in for this. And that might be true for a lot of people, but that is not where I was at that point in my life. See, I had grown a lot in my faith up until then, but a year prior to that, I had this opportunity to actually be in ministry at my home church. I was involved in our youth group, and our youth pastor left, and they asked me to fill in for him for a year. And there were a lot of great things that happened that year and a lot of growth that happened, but at the same time, I also got burned by some people. I saw some of the dark side of things that can happen in churches sometimes. And there were a few people in particular who burned me pretty bad, and I was not ready for that at that point in my life. And so that burn that I felt led to some bitterness and to some anger. And so here I was, ready to go to school to become a pastor, and I was also questioning all sorts of stuff, like, do I really want to do this for the rest of my life? I mean, what if I encounter more people like that someday that try to hurt and abuse me because I'm a pastor? Like, do I want to put up with that? Do I want to go through that again? And that bitterness and that anger also led to some other questions, and I came to this point where kind of everything that I believed, I was willing to say, okay, God, I'm going to put it all on the table. And it was really this place of where I was saying, God, if you are real, if the Bible is true, and if you really want me to serve you in ministry in this way, I need you to prove something to me here. I can't just go into this without a little bit of reassurance from you that this is the right step, that you are real, and that you are good, and that you're for me, and that this is the right path that I'm supposed to go down. And so, like I said, I kind of put it all out on the table, and I was asking questions I had never really asked before, and willing to entertain some ideas I had never really thought about. And again, like that might not seem like the place where you're ready to go to pastor training school, but that's where I was. But here's the thing: is that I think actually put me in a good position as I was beginning that training, because it's like every class that I went into, I was almost challenging, not directly, but in my mind, it's like I was challenging my professors to show me this is really true, and to help me come to a place where I can really believe this, so that I could go all in, so that I could actually serve God with my life. And that place, it was kind of this narrow road between cynicism and honestly asking questions, or really being teachable. And I feel like it kind of made me more of a sponge, right? That I was asking questions because I wanted to have the right answers. And I remember very frequently, I would go home on a break or something, and people from my home church or people that I knew growing up would ask me how seminary was going, and like my go-to answer was, I had no idea how much I didn't know before I started school. I mean, prior to that, like I had a lot of answers, kind of cookie-cutter answers about the Bible that I thought were true, that I was pretty convinced of, but I was not asking a lot of questions. I was not trying to go deeper. But by being willing to ask the questions, all of a sudden I realized I can go as deep as I want to go. God is a lot bigger and a lot deeper than I ever had imagined before. And every question I would ask, would lead to answers, which would lead to more questions. And I realized it's not a bad thing to be asking these questions. This is actually deepening my faith. And so, like I said, I started those 4 years in a very, very bitter kind of place, asking a lot of questions. But I finished those 4 years probably stronger in my faith than I'd ever been before. But it's because I was willing to ask the questions. Now, here's the thing, though, is that I think the reason I didn't ask those questions earlier in my life, and the reason a lot of us don't ask those questions, is fear. What's holding us back from asking questions? A lot of times it's fear. And it can be fear from a couple of different sources. It might be fear of, what are other people going to think? People might judge me if I ask a certain question. Or they might think that my faith is weak. Or, how can you believe this? Or how can you not believe that? Isn't the answer obvious? And they're gonna judge me. But it can also be fear of just what I might discover, fear of just an internal fear, not of what other people are going to think of, but what's going to happen to me. Have you ever been sick before, or maybe you've got like a pain in your side or some kind of illness, you're not sure what it is, and you make the mistake of Googling your symptoms. And you laugh because you know what a mistake that is, because what happens when you Google your symptoms? On one hand, you hear like, it's just a cold, it's going to pass, you're fine. On the other hand, you hear you have 3 days to live, you have a horrible disease, and you're going to die, right? And I can't tell you how many times I've done this before, and I convince myself, oh no, this is it, I'm dying. And of course, I end up being fine. What I usually do in those situations is I just close the computer, and I'm like, I'm just going to ignore that. I didn't read that. I'm going to pretend I didn't see that. That is not a possibility right now. I think that that's a lot of times what we do when we have these tough faith questions. We have the question, and on one hand, it might be, okay, here's the answer, and it's going to help you grow in your faith. But maybe the answer is like, this isn't real at all. And your whole life has been a waste, right? And we're afraid, what if I get led down that path? And what if I come to conclusions that I'm not prepared for, that are kind of scary to me right now? And so what we do is we just kind of ignore the question. And when we do that, though, we're also eliminating the possibility of that question driving us deeper in our faith and helping us to find better answers and growing closer in our relationship with God. And I know that it can be scary because maybe we've seen people who, they start to ask questions. The next thing we know, they're drifting away. But I know from my experience and from experience of many friends that I have and other stories that I've seen is that asking those questions is also the path to getting deeper in your faith and growing closer to God if we ask them with the right attitude, the right mindset, and go to the right source to get the answers. So let's continue with the story and see how this works out for this father and the son. When Jesus saw the crowd was running to the scene, he rebuked the impure spirit. "You deaf and mute spirit," he said, "I command you, come out of him and never enter him again." Jesus was just waiting for this man to acknowledge he was in this place between belief and unbelief before he finally said, "All right, I'm going to do what you're asking me to do and heal your son." The spirit shrieked, convulsed him violently, and came out. The boy looked so much like a corpse that many said, "He's dead." But Jesus took him by the hand and lifted him to his feet, and he stood up. Again, this highlights, that verse in John 10:10, the thief comes to steal and kill and destroy. Jesus has come that we may have life and have it to the full. In a last-ditch effort, this evil spirit is trying to kill this boy. But Jesus says, "No, I am the path to life." He raises him back up to his feet. He not only gets the spirit away from him, but he brings this boy to a level he had never been before. He is completely healthy. He is completely whole. He can talk again. He can hear. All of the problems that the spirit had caused are gone. And his life is better than it has ever been before because the father was willing to admit that he was in this place between belief and unbelief, and Jesus helped bring him fully to the belief side. Here's the really interesting part of the story. In verse 28, after Jesus had gone indoors, his disciples asked him privately, "Why couldn't we drive it out?" Now again, earlier in the book of Mark, Jesus had commanded his disciples to go out and to perform miracles and, among other things, to drive out evil spirits, and they were doing it. So why couldn't they do it this time? He replied, "This kind can only come out by prayer." I think what he is getting at here is he's telling them, you need to rely on God's power for this to happen. This is just my hunch, but I think what was going on is that earlier when Jesus had sent his disciples out, and he said, "I want you to go out in God's name and perform these miracles," they knew that they were going out by God's power. And they were doing what God was leading them to do, and they were able to drive out demons. They were able to perform miracles because they were doing it, acknowledging that it was really God working through them. But somewhere along the lines, I think they started to forget that it was God working, and it was really them working. And when this man came to them with this boy, and they tried to drive the demon out, again, it says, we couldn't do it. Of course they couldn't do it. Only God can do it. And he had previously done this sort of thing through them, but now they were trying to do it on their own. And Jesus is reminding them, you need God's power. You need prayer. You need to go to God with this so that he can work through you. And that's exactly what happens when we come to God with these questions. God, when we go to him as the source to find our answers, we're going to find the right ones that lead us closer to him and not further away from him. That's why the church needs to be a place where we can be comfortable asking our questions and expressing our doubts so that we can find the right answers. And so this is what I want to encourage you to do this week, some action steps that you can take. We need to get help with our unbelief. We need to recognize that we exist in that space between belief and unbelief, between needing to know some answers and yet not having them. So we need help with that. And so the first thing I want you to do is just write down, like, what is that question? Maybe it's a few questions, but what is the big faith question or the big doubt that you're struggling with, the doubt that's keeping you from going to the next step? Maybe it's the one that's preventing you from giving your life to Jesus in the first place, or the doubt that's making you struggle to go a little bit deeper in your faith, or to commit to serving Jesus, or to following him in a deeper and fuller way. What is that question that's holding you back from that next level? And then, I'm a big fan of pro-con lists. In this case, I want you to have a belief-unbelief list. So on one hand, what do you for sure believe about this question? But on the other hand, what are you struggling to believe? Or how do you not have belief regarding this question? Because again, like we talked about last week, it's really good to focus on what do I know is true? What do I believe is true? It's good to keep that in perspective, but also be willing to admit, here's the areas where I struggle. And not be afraid to ask those questions. And then the next step, so we write the question down, we acknowledge, what do I believe about it? Where am I struggling with this one? The next thing I want you to do is commit to spending at least 15 minutes a day for the next week just talking to God about this one. And here's a breakdown that you can use. Spend 5 minutes just in prayer. Just talking to God, saying, God, here's the issue that I'm wrestling with. Here's what I believe is true. God, here's where I'm struggling. I need your help. I need you to guide me to the right answers. Just spend 5 minutes talking to God about your question, or about your doubt, your struggle. And then spend the next 5 minutes in the Bible. What does God's word have to say about that question or about the issue that you're wrestling with? And if you know where to turn, that's great. If you know some verses off the top of your head. If not, you can ask me or ask somebody else that you can trust, where are places I can go, or look up some Bible reading plans maybe that address that issue. If all else fails, just turn to the Gospels. Or go to some of the letters in the New Testament like Romans and just start reading and see where God takes you with that. But spend some time in God's Word because that is his main way of speaking to us. So what does he have to say about that issue? And then finally, spend some time in reflection, 5 minutes just reflecting. Thinking about what did God's Word say about this issue? Where is God leading me in this direction? And then the next step would be honest with another friend about this, particularly like a Christian friend, somebody who's maybe a little further along, somebody that can mentor you. And just be willing to be open and not be afraid of what they're going to think or any of that stuff, but just be willing to be open with somebody. And then if you want to take an even bigger step, write your question down and put it on one of these conversation bubbles that we have around the room. Like Ed said, we're going to spend the next few weeks through Easter addressing these stories in the Gospels of Jesus, talking to people about belief. But then we're going to spend a few weeks after Easter actually addressing some of the questions that you guys have. And so if you have a question that you would like to see addressed there, put it up on the board or put it up on one of these conversation bubbles. One thing that this does is it shows us that we all have questions. None of us have it all figured out. All of us have different questions about faith. But then it also might help you get that answer if we can address that question together. So write that question down, especially go to God with it, but also be willing to go to somebody else with it that can help you in that process. You can find those sticky notes somewhere in the back, and I'd love to address some of those questions in a few weeks. I'm going to have the band come up. Let's pray and just go to God, with this sense of being in this place between belief and unbelief. Dear God, I thank you that you are a God who loves us no matter what we've done, no matter what we think, no matter how we struggle, and no matter what doubts we have. You are comfortable with us coming to you with our questions and expressing those doubts and our frustrations and our fears. And I pray that we would do that we would turn to you first and foremost before we go to any other source, that we would turn to your church and that Christ Community Church would be a place where people feel comfortable asking their questions. Where they feel like they can get good, honest answers, and where they don't feel judged and criticized because they had a certain question or struggled with a certain area of faith. God, I pray that you would help us to just be compassionate and merciful to those who doubt, because we all struggle with doubt in some way, shape, or form. And so I pray that we could be honest about it so that we can find the answers so we can choose the right path and move forward into a deeper relationship with you. And it's in Jesus' name I pray. Amen.